Pokémon as a franchise has a wide array of games, spanning multiple genres. Obviously, not every one is considered a mainline game. Stuff like Pokémon Snap is clearly a spin-off from the main games, but the distinctions aren't always so clear-cut. Pokémon Colosseum and Pokémon XD Gales of Darkness are Pokémon games on the GameCube. They are like the 3D battle games, very much like the Stadium games. However, they also have story modes attached to them. Not only do they have story modes, but the gameplay is ripped straight from the mainline games. You explore an area, catch and train Pokémon in a team of 6, heal at a Pokémon Center, and so on and so forth. However, the games don't feature gyms, instead opting at an attempt of a seemingly slightly more mature story, even if it makes them unnecessarily edgy at times. There's also the biggest difference in the formula. In Colosseum, there is just no wild Pokémon. Every Pokémon you can catch is a shadow Pokémon that you have to use a stag machine in order to steal from another trainer. A pretty stark difference from how you obtain them in the mainline games. XD introduces a few wild Pokémon, and when I say few, I mean specifically 9. Between both games, there's less than 10 different species of Pokémon you can catch in the wild. While it may not seem so on the surface, this is a drastic change. No longer do you have the ability to make a team with any Pokémon you want. You are instead very limited in your choices. Colosseum has 48 Shadow Pokémon, and XD has 83. While this doesn't count the small handful of non-shadows you can get, in a generation with 386 Pokémon, having either about an eighth or a quarter of all Pokémon to choose from, it can be extremely limiting. Sure, it may force you to use Pokémon you would normally not use, but after a couple replays, the options for new Pokémon to try become next to non-existent. Now, from what I've talked about, these games don't necessarily scream mainline, but I've yet to mention one key feature. These games can trade with the Generation 3 mainline games. Pokémon you catch in the GameCube titles, as long as they're not currently a Shadow Pokémon, can be traded to one of the Game Boy Advance games with no problem. This is easily the biggest defense for these games to be mainline. They mostly play like the mainline games, and they can trade with them. Surely they must be mainline as well. But on the flip side, they're also continuations of the Stadium series. And those games could interact with the Gens 1 and 2 mainline games, being able to use your teams in the Stadium game modes, as well as being able to store your Pokémon on them. As a side note, I highly recommend this. The Stadium games don't rely on batteries to save, so you have no worry about losing your classic era Pokémon in the event of a dead battery. Now, Colosseum and XD don't have a straight up Pokémon storage, with that being dedicated to its own title now, Pokémon Box, which is its own whole thing I'll talk about some other time. But the point comes down to how the compatibility between the mainline Gen 3 games and the GameCube games, the trading specifically, is a result of the games already needing to connect. The games need the connection to maintain the status quo from the Stadium titles, being able to battle in 3D on the big screen with your teams from the mainline titles. The story mode is just an added bonus to beef up the title from being just another Stadium game. This may sound like I'm just ragging on these games, but I'm not. I do have a genuine soft spot for these titles, ever since I was a lad and walked into an EB Games and saw a used copy of XD just sitting there. These GameCube titles have been a special little gem in my adoration for the Pokémon series. Seeing and playing an actual Pokémon journey in 3D on my favorite console of my childhood will always stand as one of my fondest memories of this franchise. Now, on the other side of the coin, we have main games that people refer to as spin-offs, those being Let's Go, Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, and Legends Arceus. All of them being Switch games, and being in what's probably Pokemon's most experimental era. Generations are no longer just freely compatible with each other. Instead, Pokemon are able to be freely moved around via Pokémon Home, and this is due to games no longer containing every Pokemon. While they may seem so disconnected, Let's Go is still a game in the 7th generation, and BDSP and Legends are both games in the 8th. Looking into each of these games a little deeper, we'll start with Let's Go. Let's Go are remakes of specifically Pokemon Yellow version. It follows the story beats while also having you play as a new character while Red and Blue have already done their adventure. You still have to fight Team Rocket though, so it's a little weird. This would be a massive disruption for the timeline if Pokemon truly cared about that. However, I feel they're far more content just going with their multiverse concept as opposed to settling on a proper concrete timeline. Now, getting back on topic, these games have you catch Pokemon, battle trainers, collect gym badges, fight the Elite Four, become champion, and have almost nothing to do in the postgame, just like good old Yellow version. The one hiccup comes with the catching Pokemon. Instead of regular wild battles, you have a catching screen similar to that of Pokemon Go's, even using motion controls to throw the Pokeballs. It's no secret that these games are attempts at enticing Pokemon Go players into becoming players of the main series games. The Pokemon also have a bit of a different stat setup, allowing for a candy mechanic also reminiscent of Go. Because of these couple of changes, people claim that they must be spin-offs, even with everything else being results of being remakes of Yellow version. Either way you slice it, these games are definitely the black sheep of the main series. Before BDSP, there was the belief that main series versus spin-off came down to the games that Game Freak made versus the ones made by other developers. However, by that metric, Pokémon Box would be a mainline game. Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, the beloved faithful remakes of Diamond and Pearl, were developed by Ilka. They also weren't a remake using the most modern game's engine and style, but a 3D chibi style that mimics the sprite work of the originals. This decision, to this day, is still very decisive. I personally do not care. The game has its own slew of problems, and so the artistic direction they went for really isn't high on my list. Now, with this not being made by Game Freak and the fact that VGC remained in Sword and Shield, a lot of people were unsure of where this game would land. By fan-created and assumed metrics, they would be spin-offs, but these are remakes of Diamond and Pearl, proper locked-in mainline games, and Masuda, the director of the originals, remained involved. Moving on to our last title, we have Legends Arceus, and it is definitely the most unique of the mainline titles. With it being much more action-oriented, you can catch Pokemon without battling, have real-time boss fights with dodge rolls, barely any trainer battles, a new system for how the battles operate, item crafting, numerous side quests, Pokédex research tasks, the ability to evolve trait evolutions by yourself, and so much more. This game is pretty distant from the mainline game structure that we know and love. Like how they lack gyms, and instead you have to fight large versions of Pokemon that protect the area, and you also have to interact with their human guardians. And you battle them in your journey, but only sometimes. And when you beat these Pokemon, you receive an item relating to one of the types. Oh, and there's also how the games give you different Pokemon you can ride on that exist instead of HMs, allowing for you to better explore the areas of the game. You can't forget about the dedicated building that allows you to take photos of you and your Pokemon, or even the big rips in space that appear. Now, the real question is whether I'm talking about Legends Arceus or if I'm talking about the Alola games. Like, they even both have Rowlet as their starter. While the gameplay is different, the skeleton is still there. Game Freak just really started to evolve the series, especially with how the next game, Scarlet and Violet, made the long-desired jump to open world. People have wanted Pokemon to branch out from the formula more and more, for the series to finally evolve, but when it started to, it's like they no longer see them as being worthy of being mainline games. I've been a fan of the series for over 20 years. I've been a fan since before I could even form lasting memories. As a kid, a game where you got to fully explore an open area and just properly interact with Pokemon, being able to study them as they live their lives, was merely but a pipe dream, but now we have it. Game Freak has been experimental the past few years with the series, trying different things whether they're a success or not. Dexit seemed like it came out of nowhere, but there were signs. Sun and Moon don't have a national Dex. All 7 generations of Pokemon are in the code, but that's because these games were continually built on top of each other. Once they made the jump to the Switch, no longer jumping from each flag post of the handheld lineage, but the proper main Nintendo home console, they had the opportunity to make changes they wanted to, such as culling how many Pokemon are in the game. Let's Go only had the original Kanto Pokemon, and then Meltan and Melmetal. And then when Sword and Shield released with a proper curated list of Pokemon, that's when the controversy struck, even when we've seen the seeds planted years before. Well, Dexit wasn't liked, it's just become part of the cycle. I'd love for a game to have every single Pokemon in it again. However, given that there is currently 1,025 Pokemon, not counting the hundreds of alternate forms, you just start to realize that it's a lot. And while it may just be making light of the non-preferred situation, I've come to actually really enjoy seeing who makes the cut in each coming game. Now, not all of these experiments are hated like Dexit though. In the files of the Alola games, there were walking animations for every single Pokemon. These didn't really see use in these games. However, Let's Go introduce wild Pokemon spawning in the overworld and reintroduce following Pokemon. Those walking animations are now in use everywhere, and these features were so popular and adored, they have been implemented into every single mainline game going forward in some capacity. There's many more examples for either side, but it's pretty obvious that they've been wanting to stretch out more and they are just slowly finally getting to work on it. Getting back on topic, in the debate of main series versus spin-off, it ultimately just comes down to what Pokemon itself declares as a mainline game and what it declares as a spin-off. That's right, there's no actual criteria or pattern or any kind of rules that determine what is what. The people that get to make the decisions just decide. It's all completely arbitrary and should not affect your enjoyment of whatever game you choose to play. It does not matter that Colosseum is a spin-off, nor that Let's Go is a main series game. They are both, at the end of the day, a Pokemon game. Each one has its own thing that makes it special or unique, whether you like it or not, and it's part of what makes this series so special to so many people. Everyone has their favorite game for whatever reason, and it's all valid. Alright, I think that's all I wanted to say. Things got a little sidetracked there, but that's how it goes. I'd like to thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed the video, I would appreciate if you were to leave a like or even subscribe, as both truly do help out the channel. I'd also love to hear from you in the comments down below, even if it's just what your favorite Pokemon game is. This has been Big Blast 99, and I hope you all have yourselves a goddamn good one.